Chapter 45. A People Who Flew. It was said, in the days before the founding of the kingdom of Hyrule, that the Hylians were known by a different name. More, they were known to only be one half of an entire soul. The other half took the form of an enormous bird, who by Hylia's grace would carry the terrestrial people through the sky. Only that unity, earth and sky, made the Hylians complete. Only that was the perfect encapsulation of the love of the goddess. Revali was not what one would call a man of faith. A man of learning, certainly. A man of ability? No one could possibly argue. A man of integrity? Fearless. A man of courage? There was none braver. But he had never been a man of faith, not really. Could anyone blame him? There had been so many concerns in the physical world that he had never had space to consider what might exist in parallel to it, so much to do with the effects of ancient conflict that he'd never taken the time to consider what had informed those conflicts. But a century was a lot of time. It was so much time. A year was a great deal of time, if you took a moment to reflect on it. A month, too, if you were waiting for an event. A day could be the length of an entire life. An hour, spent waiting, might be an eternity. So, yes, a century was a lot of time. And Revali, once he'd exhausted himself in his attempts to be free, had taken a lot of that time to think to himself. He'd never been a man of faith, but he had enjoyed the stories that the elders told of what Hylia was really like and why the orthodoxy of the Hylians was wrong about her. That Hylians were one half of a soul, and that birds were the other half. Why, what would the whole soul be like, then? Surely, the elders had said, this harmonious perfection was found in the Rito. So it was that the goddess had saved the Hylians in days long past by lifting them into the sky, but she had not done this for the completed people. Why would she have to, when they could fly? What had they to fear? He never believed that story. Hylia was a Hylian god. It was in her name. She loved Hylians best, if she was real, and by now Revali was confident that she existed, and there was no getting around that. The elders had only been making themselves comfortable, describing a universe in which the Rito could be the center of a world that did not care about them at all. They, who had forgotten even the power of flight, were supposed to believe that they were the most beloved of the heavens. Revali had clawed at their history, seeking purchase in the firmament of their legacy. He believed not in Hylia, nor the Rito. He believed, firstly, in himself. If he could believe in himself enough, if he could master the skies as the Rito had in days long since lost to history, then perhaps he could spread that mastery, that belief, to the rest of his people. They could have the heavens for themselves again, would have no need to call on the gods. But it was a nice story, still. Of the champions, Revali was the scout, and here he was, reduced to a sentinel, bound to a single place. Dead. Chained. He tried to free himself, of course, and who knows if he might have succeeded if he'd been so chosen by some arbitrary quirk of destiny. But he could not. He tried until it made no more sense to try, and then he stopped. He turned his eyes outward, focusing on the other champions, watching them. Urbosa kept fighting, would probably continue until she ceased to exist. She didn't know when she was beaten. Revali could appreciate that ignorance. Mipha watched, but her eyes were set ever on the castle. Was she even aware of the other champions in the way that Revali was? Could she be? He wasn't sure. Daruk waited. To think someone in this situation could wait, so comfortable in their own inevitable freedom that the world need only catch up to their expectations. Just like Daruk, then, it would be admirable if it wasn't so insipid. Revali couldn't do these things. He didn't have Urbosa's indomitable willingness to struggle without purchase, nor Mipha's single-minded devotion, nor Daruk's appalling ability to just wait. All of these were beyond him. Beneath him? Beneath him. He would have slept, if he could. Sleeping, even forever, seemed preferable to endless consciousness. He soon discovered, however, that he couldn't sleep. Apparently, sleep was a function of the body rather than the spirit. How convenient for the tormentor of the champions. Still, he thought, and his thoughts traveled down familiar paths, and though he could not sleep, Revali began to dream. He dreamed in his wakefulness. He dreamed away a century. While his compatriots were struggling in their ignorance, Revali soared through the skies of Hyrule. All around him were the Rito, not just of the village but all the Rito from all over the world, those more like birds and those less, and they were one flock, headed to one roost. He flew at their head, and they followed him, and all was well. They paid no mind to the earth below. There were no gods, no Ganon, no wars waged by stupid peoples whose feet would never leave the earth. Only him. Only his people. Only the sky. While his compatriots were imprisoned, Rivali was free. His dream was disturbed when Memphis' chains broke. He did not slip from sleep to wakefulness, because he had not slept. He simply saw as the Zora princess was pulled free by a golden light. He tried to dream again but did not get very far along that path before the sky was rent open once more and Dark's laughter drowned out everything. Liberation. Rivali muttered to himself in that endless purgatory, is a noisy business. Maybe he was sleeping. Maybe that was why time was passing so differently now, why the release of the other champions seemed to be taking place with more and more rapid succession. Maybe that was why he could feel at peace, and not at all dwell on how Zelda hadn't come for him yet, but he was probably needed and thus would most assuredly be next. Maybe that was why Urbosa's freedom would have frightened him half to death if he hadn't already been dead. The lightning storm pulled him out of his lucidity as thunder rocked the darkness. His eyes were sharp, even in death, and he could see Urbosa reaching out to the golden light, and in the golden light he could see Zelda's face, joyous and hopeful and afraid all at once. Well, he thought, one must save the best for last, I suppose. It had all happened so quickly. Had it only been days between all of the champions? Perhaps hours? One didn't need to be Daruk to be patient for that long. Why, it was only natural to see the imminence of his rescue and to anticipate it. But he was not a fledgling, to peep and squawk his eagerness. He could wait. He could. He did. But an hour was an eternity. A day was many. And surely he had been waiting for another 100 years since Urbosa's release. Still, the time came, as it must. The darkness above him grew brighter, like a spot in his vision if he still had physical eyes. Then it cracked. Then it broke, and a golden radiance both brighter and gentler than the light of day shone down on him. There was Zelda, shining gold, and didn't she look sure of herself? After only 3 times, the princess seemed to consider herself an expert on this process. "Took you long enough," he said. Zelda was halfway to saying something when her mouth froze in a perfect expression of surprise. Whatever she'd meant to get out, whatever wisdom or urgency she'd meant to impart, was lost. Well, if it had been that important, she probably couldn't have been stopped so easily. "Come on, Thane." Rivali reached out with one wing. "What are you waiting for? It's time for me to save the day." She must have been convinced, because she smiled. "I suppose it is." They reached across the dark. The blight closed with Zelda, its wings cutting through the air with a brutal precision. It did not have arms, only its wings, but in the talons of its left foot it clutched a long, thin sword, and in its right it held a bow that radiated malice. It was almost completely unarmed save for the plate that covered its face, and even that did not obscure its mouth, which hung wide and was full of glistening teeth as long as a Hylian's fingers. It was with those teeth, not as weapons, that it reached for the goddess reborn as she filled the sky with golden light. Its jaw widened, its fangs glistening inches from her face. Its teeth closed on nothing. A dark blue streak tore through the air in a wide arc above and away from the blight. The beast roared, tracking the movement of its prey with its eyes, and began to climb. Then the whirlwind hit it as it crossed into the influence of Rivali's gale, and it began to tumble. It roared again, exerting its own power of a greater scale than Rivali's, though not so refined, to dispel the turbulence, riding itself. Then Rivali slammed into its chest, talons first. It shrieked as he tore at it, and then the ancient short sword was in his grip and he slashed across its chest. "This is a good sword," he said aloud. The blight snapped at him with its teeth, and the direct bite would kill him, no doubt about that. And he cut across its jaw, forcing it back before kicking off and turning in a lazy arc away from it. The monster regained its bearings almost instantly, and Rivali did have to admire the speed with which it began to close the distance between them. But what was speed by itself, really? Something that could only fly straight at a high velocity was no better than Daruk's brute strength. Rivali looked over his shoulder, taking note of how weighed down the monster was with its weapons, the width of its wings, how they were single pieces of skin rather than feathered. Noting the range of movement, he calculated the thing's minimum turning radius at his current speed, and the result left him shaking his head in pity. Half a second before it would have slammed into his back, Rivali flared his wings and peeled up and away, somersaulting over the beast as it streaked by beneath him. He was already notching an arrow before he saw its back. The monster roared as the arrow took it in the left shoulder blade, near the joint controlling its wing. The arrow burst into purple flames and faded to nothing, but the monster still bled. Still, Rivali said, going into a dive to lure the blight into chasing him. It's going to be hard to kill the thing with just this weapon. In fact, I'd say it's worse than useless. Well, not exactly useless. A swallow bow was the very standard for craftsmanship among Rito boys. But for someone of his peerless skill, someone who could claim, without artifice or exaggeration, to be the best of the Rito archers, only an equally peerless weapon would do. Though, no, the swallow bow was not useless, but it was utterly unsuited to the task at hand and to the wing of the warrior who would wield it. As he pulled out of the dive and summoned his gale to rise at a speed that not even the blight could keep up with, he let the bow go, and it spun off into oblivion. He began to rummage through the rest of Zelda's bows. Rivali, Zelda's voice said in the space they were sharing. What are you doing? I am trying to see if you have any weapons that will actually harm our opponent. I'm beginning to have my doubts. A wooden bow good for distance firing, but not suited to rapid use. A Hylian piece that had been corroded over time and wouldn't stand up to the tension necessary to pierce the blight's hide. Nothing but subpar options. Subpar? There's nothing subpar about them. I've fought monsters, fought Lionels, with these weapons. How surprising, then, that you have not one that is suited to my talents. I wonder if you... Hello? What's this? He drew out a heavy stone bow, threaded with light. His patterning and make seemed very similar to one of the Guardians, or even Meadow, which meant it was so heavy that he might as well have been trying to shoot arrows out of a piece of unfinished iron. You see? This might be the worst of them all. Better for both of us if I just... Rivali, don't you dare drop that bow. Och, fine. He dipped, and the blight sword passed through the air he had just been occupying. He climbed again, the short sword blazing, and hacked away at the blight's wings as it tried to maneuver away from him. But I'm still going to need a good bow to take care of this. Where's mine? Yours. Yes. The Great Eagle Bow? Only the finest weapon Hyrule has ever seen. Surely you have some inkling of how important such a weapon would be. Zelda groaned. I don't know. If it's anything like the weapons of the other champions, then it's being kept safe. But I don't know where it is. Can you not fight the blight without it? Certainly I could, if you don't mind balancing the fate of the battle, the kingdom, and the entire world, on inferior craft. The princess's rising irritation giving way to resignation was a sign that he was right, in his estimation. I can't tell you where it is, but either of the other reader with us may be able to. One of them, Haas, is a historian, and the other... Rivali did not wait for her explanation. He kicked off the blight's back, sending it tumbling even as he soared higher on the gale's updraft, and from the higher vantage point he took in the entire horizon. So focused, heroically focused, if he allowed himself to be honest, on the blight, he had not taken the time to note who else was present. In the distance was Meadow, and nearly so far in the opposite direction was a blue-feathered man who Rivali instantly recognized as being unable to fight. Near it was a Hylian woman with silver hair, handling a paraglider with some degree of skill, and a white-feathered individual whose bearing made Rivali almost sigh with relief. Finally, he said, someone who will be able to recognize talent. What? Rivali didn't answer. He brought himself around, heading toward the other warrior with all the speed he could muster. Chiba had never seen anyone fight like this before. He had heard stories of Rivali's prowess, yes, but he had lived his entire life assuming that those stories were embellished or even fabricated. Who could possibly believe in the legendary skill of a long-dead man who had died in combat only because he'd been unarmed? Who had rediscovered flight on behalf of his people, only to have the knowledge lost because he never chose a successor? Chiba was not given over to believing in stories. Saki did, and she passed that down to Chillin against Chiba's wishes. But now he understood how someone could say the things that were said about the Rito champion, so long lost to history. Rivali was a blur in the air, dipping and cutting in directions that would have torn Tiba's wings from his shoulders, transitioning seamlessly from climbs to dives, closing distance with a monster the size of a flying Gorn as if he had no fear at all. Looking at him was odd, as if he was occupying the same space as Zelda's body, but every time Tiba really tried to focus he could only see Rivali. Rivali, with a blue sword in his hands. Rivali, his bow spinning away toward the earth below. Rivali, fighting with his talons as if he were fishing. Rivali, breaking off from the engagement and heading toward Tiba at an eye-searing pace. The speed at which the champion was headed for him should have meant that they would collide at speeds that would either seriously injure or kill them both. Every nerve in his body was screaming at him to move, to avoid Rivali with the same urgency as he would avoid the blight that was now adjusting its heading to intercept them. Except that Rivali's eyes were focused, and clear, and locked directly with his. Tiba held his position, beating his wings to hover in place, counted down the seconds until impact as Rivali tore through the sky toward him. 4, 3, 2, 1. Tiba resisted the urge to close his eyes as wind buffeted him in the face. He kept his balance as Rivali stopped less than a meter away from him. And yes, it was Rivali, and he realized that up to that point he'd been nursing doubts about it, doubts that were here dispelled. Rivali wasn't just himself. Tiba understood that Zelda was channeling the dead champion in some way, and of course Rivali had died a century before, but there was something to the cast of the figure's eyes, the easy posture with which he stayed in the air, which spoke to the truth of every story that had been told about the architect of the Gale. "You look like you have your priorities straight," Rivali said. Tiba could have argued, should have, really. Instead he only grunted, urging the champion to continue. "I'm looking for my bow. The Great Eagle Bow. I assume you've heard of it." The blight was drawing very close, now, itself seconds away from slamming into both Rito and the question Rivali posed still struck Tiba as so odd that he did not immediately react to the danger. "Your bow? Why do you?" No, I get it." And he did get it. It was stupid, beyond brazen, completely self-centered to a degree that would have been damning in anyone, but it was also completely in keeping with the stories of Rivali. "It's being kept in a chest by the elder of the village." He jerked his head in the direction of the blight. "If you can hold that thing off for a few minutes, I'll retrieve it for you." "Ah, thank you, but no, that won't be necessary." "What?" "He should descend, by the way. Hard. Now." A blast of wind nearly threw Tiba backward as Rivali rocketed into the sky, and Tiba did not ask. He tucked his wings and dropped. The blight passed over him by inches, the trailing sword in its claws tracing a line of potential destruction through Tiba's feathers. Fine tufts were rent free, but no feathers were lost, no flesh rent. He looked up at the beast, hoping to defy should it turn on him, but it didn't. It screamed in rage, beating its massive wings as it turned its wide radius to follow the retreating champion. The retreating champion who was flying with all speed toward Rito village. There was a moment where Tiba imagined, not by choice, what would happen if the monster reached the rest of the Rito. The devastation it would bring down on his home, his people, his family. Saki. Chulin. He thought of nothing else. He turned his wings, his shoulders roaring in protest as he pulled himself out of the dive, and with all the speed in his body he corrected his arc to pull himself up. He couldn't match the blight's raw speed. He couldn't propel himself with meticulous control of the air like Rivali, but in that moment it didn't matter. His family was on the other side of the valley, and the divine beast and pyre and castle disappeared into the background as his entire existence narrowed until it was only the cone in front of him, until all he saw was the blight's back. Tiba flew. Rivali. In the space where souls could touch, Zelda's voice echoed off of everything, not with the weight of her own conviction but with the power of Hylia, bolstering her in every facet. "Your Highness." With the goddess's awareness she was able to look at him with a fidelity that would have beggared the imagination of her mortal body, never mind her own senses. If she had been the very architect of his soul, who had assembled the pieces and adjusted them so they would fit together, who had given them motion and written the laws which dictated their interaction, she could not have known him better. And still, through all of that, despite seeing how his dreams flowed across the surface of his soul and his hopes were a raging storm cloud that gave voice to ambitions that he had not dared to speak, she found herself confounded. Why? She found herself sounding angry, stopped, reeled herself in. She was aware of herself too, after all. She could control her mood, at least somewhat, when she was like this. Do I want to be angry? Yes. Yes, I do. But not yet. Let him explain himself first. When she continued, she sounded level and inquisitive. Why are we headed for Rito village? My bow is there, he said, short and curt, and as if that was the whole explanation. Oh, yes, perfect. Just what she needed to hear to put her mind at ease, as if there wasn't a Sheikah-crafted ancient bow on his back that he could use to hit an arbitrarily small target from 1,000 paces. No, keep it together. Time passes differently here. Let him explain himself. Talk to him. Reason with him. She said, I trust that you're aware that the blight is in pursuit. He chuckled. So it thinks, anime. It's faster than you are. On a straight shot, sure, but it can't take advantage of a tailwind in the same way I can. Don't worry, Your Highness. I'll make sure your body is in one piece at the end of this. It is not the soundness of my body that concerns me. Controlled. Given that the two of us are more than capable of defeating the blight on our own, wouldn't it make sense for us to make our stand here, with the weapons available? I don't think so. No. There were, of course, limits to her self-control. Rivali, I'm sure you have a great deal of meaning invested in your weapon and the time you spent with it, but lives are at stake. Many lives. I am not willing to put innocent people at risk to satisfy your ego. He flinched. She could see why. Written in the color of his soul, she had thought he would have been angry at the accusation, but instead he was wounded by it. Do you really think I'm that petty? I don't know you, Rivali. Not truly. I only have scattered memories, and there was always distance between us, far more than the other champions. I want to like you, but I don't know you except for how you comport yourself when your vanity is on the line. He made a disgusted sound, then finally turned his full attention to her. In the physical world, the body they shared banked, and a twisting of the feathers on Rivali's wings redoubled the force of the gale, shooting them forward to slip out of the range of the blight. Fine, then. Since you can't seem to find space in that pretty head to see me like you see the others, I'll make it simple for you. No, I'm not that small. This isn't really about the bow. He paused, considering, though it will involve the bow. She rubbed at her face with her hands, taking comfort in the familiarity of the action even if it wasn't physically real. I need to understand, and you are not helping. What's not to understand? You haven't told me what your intentions are. Your specific intentions. Your plan of action. Anything more than that you intend something. He shook his head. And it's not enough to just trust me? She was very aware, in that moment, of the degree of power that she wielded. If she wanted to, she could take back control of her body in an instant. The channeling of the champions was a two-part effort, and her denial of the process would take Rivali out of the equation instantly. She could do that, she knew. She could take back control and turn in the air with her paraglider, turning on the blight with the power of the other champions. Urbosa's fury and Daruk's protection would end the battle before it had even properly begun. If she so desired, she might be able to kill the beast with nothing but her own divine power. She was also aware, however, that this would have been wrong. Not morally or tactically wrong. Acting in order to protect the people of the village was morally superior to whatever this was. And it made no sense to involve potential bystanders in a fight with an enemy of this scale, but wrong in the sense that she intuited, on some level, that Rivali was meant to be involved, that this was what was supposed to be happening. She hated that thought, the sense that she was being bound to behave in a specific way by the outline of a celestial narrative which she had little ability to influence, but it was there, and she understood that it was true. Her heart beat. The calamity roared. Link fought in the heart of Hyrule Castle, and she needed Rivali. She needed him, not just to expand her awareness, not just to awaken more of her power, though that was true too. There was something else he was supposed to do, some hurt that he was supposed to heal that Zelda herself couldn't touch. It had been that way for Miffer and Daruk and Urbosa too, hadn't it? But what? She found herself turning the problem over in her head, considering the different angles by which she could obviate the need to play along with this game. Would she be able to help Tiba find some deeper purpose? Could she allay Saki's fears? Could she speak to some deeper need of the Rito, one that she lacked the perspective to perceive in the first place? In the end, she knew that all her hoping and praying and planning would amount to very little. Prayer had never availed her in the past, after all. "No," she said. "I can't trust you, Rivali. Like I said, I don't know you. All I can do is believe you. But please, please, give me something, anything that will help me to understand." The smile that pulled at Rivali's eyes was wry, almost bitter. "Belief, huh? All right. I guess we all need someone to believe in." She said nothing in response. She waited. The Rito were returned in the vastness of that space, gesturing with his wing as if to indicate a sky that hung above the infinite darkness. "Do you know that, once, the Rito could fly, not glide as most do now, but fly. Truly fly, despite our size. Most at these stories, because the physics don't work out. We're too big, too heavy, and our wings are too small. The air couldn't support us, and we wouldn't be able to push it away in any case. But once, a long time ago." He paused. "You flew?" He nodded. "I think we probably didn't have concepts about the physics of flight back then. We didn't have to worry about it, it just worked. We just worked. We were whole souls, closest to all souls." He turned his head so that he was looking away from her. She didn't understand why, but felt a flare of embarrassment from him. "Look, never mind. That part doesn't matter. What matters is that the Rito used to fly, until we couldn't anymore. We lost something essential, either in ourselves or in the world. I don't know what, but when it was gone we couldn't get it back." The embarrassment died down, replaced with real vulnerability, and he turned back to her. "I spent my whole life trying to find that something again." There was an echo, like a taste of memory, that passed across her thoughts. She saw snow on the flight range, and Rivali kneeling in his exhaustion, but no more. Rivali's gale. "Ah, wouldn't that be a pretty answer? And I thought it was, for a long time. Maybe we used to control the wind subconsciously, and we just forgot how. But I've been dead for 100 years, which is ample time for reflection, and I don't think that's it." He gestured again, not toward the sky but toward the village. "Of course, we could still stand to learn to control the gale. It's a technique worth keeping, which I expect you to make use of when this is over, and I hope that eventually somebody else will figure it out. But it's not why we can't fly." In the world outside, the blight lunged for them. Rivali twisted and dipped and raked his talons across the beast's throat. Its fangs closed on empty air as he slashed it, then threw an arrow, not even shooting it but flinging it with a turn of his wing, directly into the monster's eye. The blight shrieked, a sound nearly as loud as Von Meadows' roar, and peeled off, turning away from them. "We can't fly because we forgot that we could, Your Highness. That may not sound like much, but it's the only way I can put it." Zelda tried to consider this, found herself unequal to the task. She was, in the end, Hylian, and the perspective and the history that Rivali carried in his breast was far past her understanding. She couldn't decry this without claiming the supremacy of her own knowledge, and even with Hylia's power, the thought made her sick. She wouldn't. But she still had her doubts, she couldn't be rid of those. People's lives were at stake, and she couldn't trust to someone else's expertise on that alone. "So, the reason we're flying toward the village?" He looked at her for a long time. He was searching her, for answers or for something else, and she understood that she could not see him as well as she had thought before. More pride, on her part, far worse than his. His eyes searched, and searched, and searched. After the long time passed he turned away from her, as if resuming active control of her body. She waited for him to speak. And he did. "I'll make you a deal, Your Highness. If things start to go wrong, if your all-powerful senses tell you that people are in danger of really dying, take back control. Actually, you know what? You won't have to. I'll just give it to you at the first sign of real trouble. Then you can put on a real light show. Call down the thunder, cut up the blight with your glowing swords, then burn it up in your awe-inspiring radiance. You shouldn't have any trouble doing that. right? She nodded. He wasn't looking at her, but that didn't matter. Good. Then, until we reach that point, until things go wrong, let me show them. Let me help them remember. He paused, wrestling for words. Let me give them something to believe. She said nothing. There was nothing to say. She nodded again. They soared onward toward the restless village. End of chapter.